Sylvia Moore described the killer perfectly. The jagged white scar on his chin, the nervous twitch in his cheek, the cold, dead gray of his eyes. She picked him out of the lineup without a single second of hesitation. It was a solid ID, enough to send a man to the chair. But a month later, 2 patrolmen who had chased the suspect that night came forward with a detail that shattered the case. They had seen the killer fleeing under the street lamps, and he was wearing a heavy canvas sack over his head tied tight at the neck. He never took it off. Sylvia Moore had identified a face she physically could not have seen, yet she knew every detail. It was November 1958. The kind of November that feels more like a wet gray blanket than a season. It had been raining for 3 days straight, a cold, relentless drizzle that turned the city asphalt into black mirrors reflecting the neon signs of the bars and diners. I was working the night shift at the 4th Precinct, nursing a cup of coffee that tasted like battery acid and burnt toast. The radiator in the corner was hissing and clanking, fighting a losing battle against the draft coming from the window. I remember looking at the clock. It was 2:14 a.m. when the phone rang. It wasn't a frantic ring, just the dull, insistent, mechanical trill that always signaled bad news. Dispatch told me there was a body in the alley behind the Starlight Lounge, a jazz joint about 6 blocks from the station. I grabbed my trench coat and hat. The damp wool smell of that coat is something I can still recall if I close my eyes. I drove out there with the wipers slapping a slow rhythm against the glass. The streets were mostly empty, just the occasional taxi splashing through puddles and the steam rising from the sewer grates like ghosts trying to escape the underground. When I arrived, the scene was already taped off, the uniformed officers standing around looking grim, their breath fogging in the cold air. The victim was a man named Arthur Vance. He was a lawyer, well known in the city, the kind who handled estate planning for the wealthy and kept his nose clean. He was lying face down in a puddle of dirty water, his expensive suit ruined. His wallet was gone, but his watch, a gold Patek Philippe, was still on his wrist. That was the first contradiction. A robbery gone wrong usually ends with the watch gone too. This felt personal, or panic-induced. I crouched down, careful not to scuff the evidence. There was a single, deep wound across his throat. Clean. Efficient. No struggle. I stood up and looked around the alley. It was a narrow chute of brick and fire escapes, lit only by a single flickering yellow bulb above the service door of the club. Shadows stretched long and deep in the corners. That's when Officer Miller pointed toward a patrol car parked at the mouth of the alley. "We got a witness, Jack," he said, lighting a cigarette and cupping the flame against the wind. "Waitress from the club stepped out for a smoke. She saw the whole thing. Stay with me until the end. The truth behind this case still unsettles me. It wasn't just a murder. It was a puzzle that defied the laws of perception." I walked over to the patrol car. The back door was open, and a woman was sitting there, her legs outside, feet resting on the wet pavement. She was shivering, wrapped in a blanket the officers had given her. Her name was Sylvia Moore. She couldn't have been more than 25, with dark hair plastered to her forehead by the rain and eyes that looked like shattered glass. She was holding a cigarette with a trembling hand, the ash growing long because she forgot to flick it. I introduced myself quietly, trying to lower the temperature of the situation. I didn't push. I just leaned against the car door, letting the rain drip off the brim of my hat, and waited. Before I tell you what happened next, please consider subscribing. It truly helps keep these stories alive. "I saw him," she whispered. Her voice was brittle. I saw him kill Mr. Vance. I took out my notepad, shielding it from the drizzle with my body. Can you describe him, Sylvia? I asked. Usually witnesses are useless in the dark. They see a shadow, a height, maybe a coat color. But Sylvia turned to look at me, and her gaze was terrifyingly focused. He was tall, she said, her voice gaining a strange, hollow strength. He wore a gray overcoat. But his face, I saw his face. He had a scar, a jagged white line right here. She traced a finger across her own chin. And his left eye, it twitched, a nervous tick, and his eyes were gray, cold, like stone. I stopped writing for a second. That was specific. Too specific for a dark alley at 2 a.m. with bad lighting. But she was adamant. She wasn't guessing. She was reciting. What would you have done in my place? Would you have trusted a witness in shock who offered that much detail? Or would you have assumed she was hallucinating? I thanked her and had the officers drive her down to the station to give a formal statement. I stayed in the alley for another hour, looking for the weapon. We found nothing. No knife, no footprints that weren't washed away by the rain. Just the body and the silence. By the time I got back to the precinct, the sun was threatening to rise, turning the sky a bruised purple. The night shift was swapping with the morning crew, the station buzzing with the smell of fresh coffee and floor wax. But the buzz changed when the patrol sergeant walked in. They had picked someone up, a drifter named Thomas Kincaid. He had been found sleeping in the doorway of a bakery 3 blocks from the crime scene. And here was the kicker. Kincaid was wearing a gray overcoat. He had a jagged white scar on his chin, and when I sat him down in the interrogation room, his left cheek jumped with a nervous tick every time I raised my voice. It felt like a gift. In police work, you don't get gifts. You get lucky breaks, sure, but you don't get the answer key handed to you before the test starts. Kincaid denied it, of course. He was a rough character, known for petty theft and brawling, but he swore he'd never killed anyone. He claimed he was asleep. He claimed he didn't know Arthur Vance, but he couldn't explain why he was 3 blocks away, and he couldn't explain the blood speck on his cuff, which he claimed was from a nosebleed earlier that day. I arranged the lineup for noon. We put Kincaid in the number 3 spot, flanked by 4 other men of similar height and build. I stood behind the one-way glass with Sylvia. She had calmed down, changed into dry clothes, but her face was still pale. The moment the lights hit the men in the lineup, she didn't scan the line. Her eyes locked instantly on number 3. "That's him," she said. No hesitation, no doubt. She pointed a shaking finger at Kincaid. "That's the man who cut his throat." It was the perfect identification. It was the kind of evidence that makes a prosecutor buy you a steak dinner. We had the guy, we had the witness, we had the proximity. I should have felt relieved. I should have been filling out the paperwork to book him for murder 1. But something nagged at me. It was the too perfect nature of it all. Kincaid's scar was small. The alley was dark. The light bulb above the service door was yellow and dim, barely 40 watts. How did she see the color of his eyes? How did she see a white scar from 20 feet away in the rain? What would you have done in my place? When the pieces fit that well, do you stop looking, or do you start looking for the cracks? I went back to my desk, rubbing my temples. The headache was setting in. I lit a cigarette and watched the smoke drift up toward the stained ceiling tiles. That's when Miller and O'Hagan, the 2 beat cops who had been first on the scene, walked over to my desk. They looked uncomfortable. Miller was twisting his cap in his hands. "Jack," Miller said, looking around to make sure the lieutenant wasn't listening. "We need to tell you something. We didn't put it in the initial report because, well, we thought we lost him and didn't want the heat." "Spit it out," I said, leaning back. When we got the call, Miller said, we were closer than we thought. We turned the corner just as the perp was running out of the alley. We saw him, Jack. We chased him for 2 blocks before he jumped a fence and vanished. So, that puts a suspect in the area. That helps us, I said. Yeah, but, O'Hagan chimed in, his voice low. Sylvia Moore said she saw his face. She described the scar, the twitch, the eyes. And she picked him out of the lineup, I reminded them. Kincaid has the scar. That's the problem, Jack, Miller said. He dropped a file on my desk. When we saw the guy running, he was wearing a mask, not a ski mask. It was a heavy canvas sack like a flour sack, tied tight around his neck with rope. Eye holes cut out, but small ones. We saw him under the street lamp, plain as day. He never took it off. I stared at them. The radiator hissed loudly in the silence. You're sure? I asked. 100%, Miller said. Canvas sack, tied with rope. There is no way, physically no way, that girl saw his face. I looked through the glass partition toward the holding cell where Kincaid was sitting, his head in his hands. Then I looked at the statement Sylvia Moore had signed. She had described a face that was hidden behind a layer of heavy canvas. She described a man she couldn't have seen, but she was right about the scar. She was right about the twitch. The rain hammered against the window, harder now. The case had just turned from a slam dunk into something dark, slippery, and completely impossible. The precinct hummed with the self-satisfied energy of a closed case. The lieutenant was already drafting the press release, praising the swift and decisive action of the department. Kincaid was in a cell, looking like a man who had woken up in a nightmare he couldn't shout his way out of. But I sat at my desk, staring at the empty space where Miller's report should have been. I had gone to the filing clerk to pull the official transcript of the patrolman's statement, the one about the canvas sack mask. It wasn't there. When I asked the clerk, he shrugged, blowing dust off a stack of traffic citations. If it ain't in the folder, Jack, it didn't happen. I looked across the room. Miller and O'Hagan were huddled by the water cooler talking to a sergeant from Internal Affairs. They looked pale. When they saw me looking, they turned away. That was the first crack in the foundation. The department didn't just want Kincaid to be the guy. They needed him to be the guy. And 2 beat cops talking about a masked man didn't fit the narrative of a clean arrest. I grabbed my hat and headed out into the rain. It was still coming down, a cold, relentless sheet that blurred the city into gray smears. I needed to know who Thomas Kincaid actually was. A drifter with a scar doesn't just bump into a high-society lawyer like Arthur Vance by accident. I drove to the address Kincaid had given during booking, a flop house called the Merriweather on the Lower East Side. The name was a lie. There was nothing merry about it. The hallway smelled of boiled cabbage and old sweat. The landlady, a woman with hair the color of iron wool and a cigarette permanently glued to her lip, let me into Kincaid's room for $5. The room was a box, a cot, a sink with a rust stain trailing down the porcelain like a dried tear, and a wobbly wooden chair. I started tossing the place. Under the mattress, I found a cigar box. Inside wasn't money or drugs, but a stack of matchbooks from the Starlight Lounge. Dozens of them. Kincaid wasn't just a drifter passing through. He was a regular at the very place where Vance was killed. Then I found the letter. It was tucked inside a hollowed-out Bible on the windowsill. It was typed on heavy, expensive stationery. Arthur Vance, attorney at law, was embossed at the top. The letter was brief. Payment is ready. Friday night. The usual spot. Don't be late, and for God's sake, keep your head down. It was dated 3 days ago. This changed everything. Kincaid wasn't a random mugger. He was on Vance's payroll. Blackmail? A payoff? Or was Kincaid working for the lawyer? What would you have done in my place? Would you hand that letter over to a lieutenant who was already burying evidence? Or would you pocket it and keep digging? I slipped the letter into my coat pocket. The rain was drumming against the single pane of glass in the room, sounding like nervous fingers tapping on a table. I left the flop house and drove toward the Starlight Lounge. It was early afternoon now, and the club was closed, but the front door was unlocked for deliveries. I stepped inside. The place smelled of stale beer and pine cleaner. The neon sign behind the bar buzzed like an angry hornet. The bartender, a man built like a vending machine named Tiny, was wiping down glasses. He didn't look up when I sat down. "We're closed, officer," he grunted. He knew the walk. "Just a few questions, Tiny," I said, sliding a $5 bill across the polished wood. "About Arthur Vance and Thomas Kincaid." Tiny's hand stopped moving. He looked at the bill, then at me. "Kincaid, the nervous guy with the scar? Yeah, he comes in here. Sits in the back. Nurses 1 beer for 3 hours." "Did he know Vance?" "They talked," Tiny said, lowering his voice. "Couple of times. Vance would come in. High-class suit, out of place. He'd sit in the booth with Kincaid. They argued. Quiet arguments, you know. The kind where nobody yells but everybody's tense." "What about Sylvia?" I asked. "The waitress?" Tiny frowned. "Sylvia's a good kid. A bit flighty. Imaginative. Reads too many romance novels. But she works hard." "Did she know Kincaid?" "She served him. She was terrified of him," Tiny said. "Said he gave her the creeps. Said he had evil eyes. She used to talk about his scar. Said it looked like a lightning bolt." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty room. Sylvia had fixated on Kincaid long before the murder. She knew his face, his scar, his twitch because she had served him drinks for months. When she looked into that dark alley and saw a man, even a masked man, her fear might have filled in the blanks. She didn't see the killer. She saw her nightmare. But that didn't explain the mask. If the killer was masked, how did she know it was him in the alley? Unless she recognized something else. The coat? The walk? As I left the club, the day had turned into an early twilight. The street lights were flickering on, casting long, jaundiced pools of light on the wet pavement. I walked to my car, fumbling for my keys. That's when I heard it. A car door closing softly about half a block down. I paused, lighting a cigarette to cover my glance. In the reflection of a shop window, I saw a black sedan parked just out of the direct light. 2 men inside. Fedoras. Smoke rising from the driver's side. They weren't police. I got into my car and pulled away slowly. The sedan pulled out too. They didn't use sirens. They just hung back, 2 car lengths behind, turning when I turned. I decided to test them. I took a sharp right down a narrow industrial road near the docks. They followed. I sped up. They sped up. This wasn't just a murder case anymore. Someone was watching the investigation. Someone who knew I was poking around the Starlight Lounge. I needed to talk to Sylvia again. I needed to know if she was lying or just confused. I drove to her apartment building, a brownstone in a neighborhood that was slowly losing its fight against decay. I parked around the corner to lose the tail, cutting through an alleyway on foot. My heart was hammering a little harder than it used to. I'm not a young man, and the damp air settles in my joints, but adrenaline is a powerful thing. I knocked on her door. Sylvia opened it, the chain still on. She looked worse than she had the night before. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and she was wearing a robe that looked too big for her. "Detective?" she whispered. "I need to ask you something, Sylvia. It's important, about the mask." She froze. The color drained from her face so fast I thought she might faint. What mask? The canvas sack the killer was wearing. The police officers saw it, Sylvia. They saw him running. He had a bag over his head. You couldn't have seen his face. She undid the chain and pulled me inside, looking frantically down the hallway. Her apartment was small, cluttered with porcelain dolls and fashion magazines. It smelled of lavender and stale fear. I know what I saw, she stammered, backing away from me. I saw the scar. Sylvia, I said gently, stepping closer. Did you see his face in the alley? Or did you just know it was him because you were afraid of him? She began to cry, silent, shaking sobs. He was there, she gasped. I went out for a smoke. I heard the noise. I saw the gray coat. I saw him standing over Mr. Vance. And then he looked up at me. And it was him, she screamed, her voice cracking. It was the face, the scar, the eyes. I saw it as clearly as I see you. She was hysterical, but she wasn't lying. She believed it. But belief isn't evidence. I was about to press her further when the phone in her hallway rang. It was a loud, jarring, mechanical ring that made us both jump. She stared at it like it was a bomb. Don't answer it, I said. She picked it up anyway, her hand trembling. She listened for a moment, her eyes going wide. She didn't say a word. She just slowly hung up the receiver and turned to me. They know you're here, she whispered. They said if I talk to you, I'm next. I went to the window and pulled back the curtain an inch. The black sedan was parked across the street. The men were out of the car now, standing under the streetlight, looking up at her window. One of them was lighting a cigarette, the flame illuminating a hard, angular face. I realized then that I had crossed a line. I had pushed past the wrong place, wrong time theory and stumbled into something organized. Vance was dirty, Kincaid was a pawn, and Sylvia was a loose end. Get your coat, I told her, my voice dropping to a command. We can't stay here. Where are we going? She cried. Somewhere safe. The station isn't safe. My apartment isn't safe. As we hurried down the back fire escape, the rain slicking the iron steps, I knew there was no turning back for me. I had a witness who saw a hallucination, a suspect who was a patsy, and a dead lawyer who was paying off the man accused of killing him. And now, the people who actually killed Vance were waiting downstairs. What would you have done? Would you have left her there and called for backup, hoping the squad cars would arrive in time? Or would you have taken a civilian into the night, knowing you were now a target too? We hit the alley floor and ran. The sound of our footsteps echoed off the wet brick, too loud in the quiet night. I checked my revolver. 6 shots. That used to feel like enough. Tonight, in the shadow of the Starlight Lounge's secrets, it felt like nothing at all. After this, there was no turning back for me. We ran until the burning in my chest felt like it was going to crack a rib. We didn't stop until we hit the old rail yards down by the river. The rain here was heavier, mixed with the soot from the diesel engines, coating everything in a slick, black film. We ducked into an abandoned signal box, a rusted metal shack that smelled of oil and damp rot. I pushed the door shut and leaned against it, listening. No footsteps, just the rhythmic clack-clack of a freight train shunting cars in the distance. Sylvia sank to the floor, her wet hair plastering her face like a veil. She was shaking so hard, her teeth chattered. I took off my coat and draped it over her, but the cold wasn't just in the air, it was inside us now. "Why are they chasing us?" she asked, her voice small and broken. "I'm just a witness." "You're not just a witness anymore, Sylvia," I said, checking the cylinder of my revolver again. It was a nervous habit I'd picked up in the war. You're a loose end, and whoever those men were, they weren't interested in taking another statement. I lit a cigarette, shielding the flame with my body to keep the light hidden. The smoke tasted bitter. I looked at Sylvia. In the dim light coming through the grime-streaked window, she looked like a child playing dress-up in a nightmare. But there was something else in her eyes. Not just fear. Guilt. "Sylvia," I said, keeping my voice low but hard. "We need to talk about the alley. The truth. Not the story you told the uniform cops." "I told you the truth," she snapped, a flash of anger cutting through the fear. "You described a face you couldn't see," I said. "The patrolman saw a mask, a heavy canvas sack. There were no eye holes big enough to see color. There was no exposed chin to see a scar. So how did you know it was Kincaid?" She looked away, staring at the rusted floorboards. I knew. That's not good enough. Not when people are trying to kill us." I crouched down in front of her. "Did you know Arthur Vance?" She froze. The silence stretched out, filled only by the distant wail of a tugboat on the river. He came into the club," she whispered. "Did you know him?" I pressed. "We were seeing each other," she admitted, the words tumbling out. "For about 6 months. He was unhappy. His wife didn't understand him, the usual lies men tell waitresses." This was the pivot, the detail that changed the landscape. Sylvia wasn't a random bystander stepping out for a smoke. She was the victim's mistress. "And Kincaid?" I asked. "Where does he fit in?" "Kincaid knew," she said, her voice trembling. "He sat in that back booth every night. He watched us. He'd see Arthur slip me a note or touch my hand. Kincaid. He started whispering things to me when I brought him his beer, calling me names, saying he was going to tell Arthur's wife if I didn't be nice to him." I stood up and paced the small shack. The pieces were shifting. Kincaid was blackmailing Sylvia, not Vance, or maybe both. "So, when you saw the man in the alley," I said, "you wanted it to be Kincaid. You hated him. You feared him. Your mind filled in the blanks." "No," she insisted, looking up with tear-filled eyes. "I saw him. I saw the way he moved, the way his shoulder dipped, and I saw the flash of the knife. Kincaid always played with a knife at the table, a little penknife. He'd clean his nails with it." "The killer didn't use a penknife," I said grimly. "He used something much bigger. One clean cut." "What would you have done? Would you have believed the terrified woman who had every reason to lie, or the cold logic of the physical evidence?" I took the letter out of my pocket, the one I'd found in Kincaid's Bible. I read it again in the faint light. "Payment is ready. Friday night. The usual spot. Don't be late, and for God's sake, keep your head down." I had assumed Vance wrote this to Kincaid, but now, looking at the high-quality paper, the embossing, something didn't sit right. I held the paper up to the moonlight. There was a watermark, a faint crest. It wasn't just legal stationery, it was judicial stationery, the kind used by the city courts. My stomach dropped. This letter wasn't from Vance. It was to Vance. Vance wasn't the one paying the blackmail. He was the bagman. He was delivering the payment. "Sylvia," I said, "think carefully. The men in the black sedan. Did you recognize them?" "No, they were just shadows." "What about the car?" "It was a Ford," she said. "Black, with a small dent on the rear bumper, and an aerial. A long whip aerial." My blood ran cold. Civilian cars didn't have whip aerials in 1958. Only police detectives and federal agents had radios that needed that kind of range. The men hunting us weren't mobsters, they were cops. I realized then that the investigation wasn't being interfered with from the outside. It was being strangled from the inside. Vance was delivering money to a dirty official. Kincaid, the stalker, had stumbled into the middle of a drop, but that still didn't explain the mask. Why would a cop, or a hired killer working for a cop, wear a canvas sack? It's clumsy. It limits vision, unless the mask wasn't a mask. The canvas sack, I muttered to myself. Miller said it was tied with rope around the neck. I looked at Sylvia. Did the man in the alley say anything? Did he make a sound? He grunted, she said, like he was struggling to breathe. A thought hit me. A terrible, dark contradiction that turned the whole case upside down. Miller and O'Hagan, Sue, I said aloud. They said they chased the man out of the alley. Yes, Sylvia said. But you saw the murder in the alley. Yes. How much time between the murder and the cops arriving? Seconds, she said. I screamed. The car was right there. I closed my eyes. The rain hammered on the tin roof. The timeline didn't work. If the cops were at the mouth of the alley seconds after the scream, they would have caught the guy. Unless the guy they chased wasn't the killer. Sylvia, I said, my voice barely a whisper. Did the man you saw, did he run away? She frowned. No, I screamed. I ran back inside the club. I didn't see him leave. I grabbed my hat. We have to go. Where? Why? Because Kincaid isn't the killer, I said, the realization settling on me like a heavy weight. And neither is the man in the mask. We've been looking at this all wrong. The man in the canvas sack wasn't wearing a disguise. He was a decoy. After this, there was no turning back for me. We left the rail yard and headed back into the city, sticking to the shadows. I needed to get to a payphone. I needed to call the one man in the department I knew I could trust, Doc Holloway, the night coroner. I needed to know what was in Arthur Vance's stomach, and I needed to know if Kincaid was still alive in that holding cell. We found a booth near a closed gas station. I dialed the morgue directly. Doc picked up on the third ring. Morgue, Holloway speaking. Doc, it's Jack. Don't use my name, just listen. Jack? His voice dropped. Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. The whole city is looking for you. They're saying you kidnapped the witness. They have a shoot-to-kill order out, Jack. They're saying you've gone rogue. I haven't gone anywhere, Doc. Listen to me. Vance, did you do the autopsy? Just finished. Jack, it's messy. The throat wound? Yeah. But that's not what killed him. I froze. What? The throat was cut post-mortem, Jack, to hide the real cause, or to make a statement. But Arthur Vance was dead before the knife touched him. His neck was broken. Clean snap. Like someone who knew exactly how to do it. And Kincaid? I asked, dreading the answer. Kincaid is dead, Jack, Doc whispered. They found him in his cell an hour ago, hung himself with his belt, left a note confessing to everything. He didn't have a belt, I said, gripping the phone receiver until my knuckles turned white. We took his belt and shoelaces when we booked him. Standard procedure. I know that, Jack. You know that. But the official report says belt. I hung up the phone. The rain felt colder now. Kincaid was murdered to close the loop. Vance was murdered by a professional. And the man in the mask running from the alley was just a show, a rabbit for the greyhounds to chase while the real wolf walked away. But Sylvia had seen a face. She had seen Kincaid's face. I looked at her, huddled in the corner of the phone booth. Sylvia, I said. We're going to the Starlight Lounge. I need to see exactly where you were standing. We can't go back there, she cried. We have to. Because I think I know why you saw Kincaid's face. And if I'm right, the killer is someone you see every day. We moved through the wet streets, ghosts in a city that wanted us dead. The noir mood was heavy, the neon signs reflecting in the puddles like spilled blood. I was tired. My bones ached, but my mind was sharp. The contradictions were aligning. The man in the mask wasn't the killer. Kincaid wasn't the killer. Sylvia saw a face that wasn't there. As we neared the alley behind the starlight, the silence was deafening. I pulled my gun. Stay behind me, I told her. We stepped into the alley. It was exactly as it had been. Dark, wet, the single yellow bulb buzzing above the door. I looked at the ground where Vance had died. Then I looked up at the light, then at the back door of the club. And then I saw it. The detail I had missed the first time because I was looking at the body, not the environment. There was a window next to the door, a window with a mirrored finish on the outside, meant to keep people from peeking into the club. If you stood where Vance fell, and you looked up. Sylvia, I said, stand here. I pointed to the spot near the door. She stepped forward, trembling. Look at the window, I said. She looked. In the dim yellow light, her reflection was ghostly, distorted by the rain and the poor glass. When you came out, I asked, was the door open or closed? Open, she said. I held it open with my foot. And who was inside? Sitting in the back booth, in your direct line of sight? Kincaid, she whispered. My God. She didn't see Kincaid in the alley. She saw Kincaid through the open door, sitting in the booth, staring at her. And in the panic, in the split second of the murder, her mind superimposed the face of the man she feared onto the shadow standing over the body. But that meant the killer was standing right next to her, or hidden in a way she couldn't process. Suddenly, a voice echoed from the mouth of the alley, calm, familiar. Good work, Jack. You always were detail-oriented. I turned slowly. At the end of the alley, silhouetted against the streetlight, stood two men. One was holding a shotgun. The other was wearing a trench coat and smoking a cigar. It was Lieutenant Miller, my partner, the man who swore he saw the mask. But you missed one thing, Miller said, stepping into the light, the rain dripping off his hat. The mask wasn't a decoy, Jack. It was a necessity. The alley felt like a tomb. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the silence was heavier than the storm. Miller stood 10 feet away, his service revolver leveled at my chest. Beside him, O'Hagan held a pump-action shotgun, his knuckles white against the dark wood of the stock. They weren't just corrupt cops. They were men who had crossed a line and burned the bridge behind them. A necessity, Miller repeated, his voice calm, almost professional. He looked like a man discussing a parking ticket, not a double homicide. You see, Jack, panic makes people do strange things. Even professionals. I kept my hands where they could see them, away from my sides. I could feel Sylvia trembling against my back. She was the only wild card here. If she bolted, O'Hagan would cut her in half with that shotgun. Let me guess, I said, keeping my tone conversational. The canvas sack. It wasn't a mask you brought with you. It was the money bag. Miller smiled, a thin, tight expression that didn't reach his eyes. Vance brought the payoff in a heavy bank sack. Canvas. Tough to tear. When things went sideways, O'Hagan here realized he had a problem. He was in uniform. If a witness saw a beat cop running from a dead body, we're cooked. But if they see a monster, a maniac in a hood, that's a manhunt for a stranger. So he emptied the cash, I said, piecing it together for Sylvia's benefit. Cut 2 holes in the sack with his knife, put it over his head, and ran. Crude, Miller admitted, shrugging, but effective. It bought us a month. It would have bought us forever if you hadn't started digging. And the throat? I asked. Vance's neck was already broken. Doc Holloway told me. Clean snap. That's a commando move, Miller. That's not a mugging. O'Hagan shifted his weight, the shotgun creaking. He struggled. O'Hagan grunted, his voice thick and gravelly. Little lawyer thought he could negotiate. I didn't mean to snap it. It just happened. So you cut his throat to hide the break, I said, to make it look like a street crime, to make it look like Kincaid. Kincaid was a gift, Miller said. We knew he was stalking the girl. We knew he carried a knife. We knew he was unstable. We just needed a witness to put him there. He looked at Sylvia, his gaze cold and flat. And you, my dear, were perfect. You wanted it to be him so badly you did our work for us. Sylvia let out a sob, a sharp intake of breath. I saw him, she whispered, but the conviction was gone. You saw what you feared, I said gently, not taking my eyes off Miller. You held the door open. You looked back. You saw Kincaid in the booth, staring at you with those dead eyes. Then you turned and saw a shadow over the body. Your brain stitched the two images together. You testified against a ghost, Sylvia. And that ghost is dead now, Miller said, raising his gun slightly. Suicide, tragic, just like what's about to happen here. Disgraced detective kidnaps witness. Murder-suicide in the alley where it all began. It's a clean narrative, Jack. The papers will love it. I looked at the window next to the service door, the one with the mirrored finish. I looked at the yellow light bulb buzzing above us. And I looked at O'Hagan. He was the weak link. He was sweating, despite the cold. He was a brute, not a thinker. There's just one problem with your story, Miller said. And what's that? I didn't call the papers, I said. I called the morgue. Miller frowned, the first crack in his composure. Doc Holloway knows. I lied. Well, half lied. Doc knew about the neck, but he didn't know about Miller. But Miller didn't know that. I told him everything before we came here. About the aerial on your car, about the timeline, about the neck snap. If we don't walk out of this alley, the autopsy report goes to the district attorney in the morning with a distinct addendum regarding police corruption. Miller hesitated. The gun wavered just a fraction of an inch. In that hesitation, the balance of power shifted. He was calculating the risk. If he killed us, he might seal his own fate. You're bluffing, Miller spat, but his eyes darted to O'Hagan. Am I? I reached slowly into my pocket. O'Hagan tensed, the shotgun rising. Easy, just a cigarette. I pulled out my lighter, the old Zippo I'd carried since the war. I flicked the lid open. Clink. O'Hagan, I said, ignoring Miller. You think Miller is going to let you live? You're the one who snapped the neck. You're the one who wore the mask. You're the loose end. Shut up, Jack, Miller warned, thumbing the hammer back. He's right, O'Hagan. I pressed, my voice hardening. Who do you think takes the fall for this? The lieutenant with the pension and the connections, or the beat cop who panicked and killed a lawyer? When the heat comes down, Miller gives you up. He probably has the canvas sack in your locker right now. O'Hagan looked at Miller. Fear is a powerful solvent. It dissolves loyalty in seconds. Boss, O'Hagan asked, where is the sack? Don't listen to him, Miller snapped, not looking at his partner. He's trying to get inside your head. Shoot him. "Where's the sack, Miller?" O'Hagan roared, swinging the shotgun barrel slightly toward his partner. That was the moment. The split second of confusion. I kicked the trash can next to me. It wasn't a hero move. It was a distraction. The metal clattered loudly against the wet brick. O'Hagan flinched to the shotgun blasting. The sound was deafening, like a thunderclap trapped in a bottle. The buckshot tore into the brick wall a foot above my head, showering us in red dust and fragments. I shoved Sylvia down behind the dumpster and dropped to one knee, drawing my revolver. Miller turned on O'Hagan. "You idiot!" Miller fired. Bang! O'Hagan grunted, clutching his shoulder, and swung the shotgun back around. The two of them were tearing each other apart, the alliance shattered by paranoia. I didn't wait. I aimed for the yellow bulb above the door, the only source of light in the back half of the alley. Crack. The bulb shattered. Darkness crashed down on us, absolute and sudden. The only light came from the distant street lamps at the mouth of the alley, silhouetting Miller and O'Hagan. "Move," I whispered to Sylvia. "Crawl." We scrambled on the wet pavement, the smell of cordite and sewage filling my nose. Behind us, I heard Miller shouting, then another shotgun blast that lit up the alley in a brief, terrifying strobe. "Jack!" Miller screamed into the dark. "You can't prove it. You have nothing." I stopped behind the cover of a concrete pillar near the fire escape. I had a clear line of sight. Miller was standing over O'Hagan, who was writhing on the ground. Miller was raising his gun to finish his partner. I couldn't let him do it. If O'Hagan died, the testimony died with him. I steadied my breathing. The rain dripped off the brim of my hat. I wasn't a killer, I was a detective. But sometimes the line blurs. I aimed for Miller's leg. Bang! The shot echoed, sharp and precise. Miller screamed and crumpled, his leg giving out. His gun clattered across the wet asphalt. "Stay down," I shouted, my voice echoing off the brick walls. "It's over, Miller." Silence returned to the alley, broken only by the groans of the two men and the distant wail of sirens. Someone had heard the shots. The cavalry was coming. I stood up slowly, keeping my gun trained on them. Sylvia rose beside me, shaking, her clothes ruined, her face streaked with grime and tears. She looked at the two men, the monsters she had been running from. Is it true?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Did I really make it all up?" I looked at her. I wanted to lie. I wanted to tell her she was right, that her instincts were good. But the truth is the only thing that matters in the end, even when it hurts. "You didn't make it up, Sylvia," I said softly. "You remembered the wrong horror. You saw a monster, and your mind gave it a face you recognized because the truth, that the monster was a policeman, was too hard to process." The sirens were close now. Red and blue lights began to flash against the wet brick, painting the alley in shifting colors. Miller was cursing, holding his thigh. O'Hagan was unconscious but breathing. I holstered my gun. My hands were shaking now. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind the cold ache of the night. I walked over to where the mask lay, figuratively speaking. The canvas sack wasn't there, but the truth was exposed. There was no mystery man, no drifter with a grudge, just greed, fear, and a witness who saw too much and too little at the same time. As the uniformed officers swarmed into the alley, guns drawn, shouting orders, I raised my hands. But I wasn't looking at them. I was looking at Sylvia. She wasn't crying anymore. She was staring at the empty air where she thought she had seen Kincaid's face. She was realizing that the most reliable witness, her own memory, had betrayed her. and that is a terrifying thing to live with. The detectives from Homicide took over. They cuffed Miller. They called an ambulance for O'Hagan. I gave my statement, sitting on the back bumper of an ambulance, a blanket draped over my shoulders. It was over. The bad guys were caught. The case was closed. But as I watched them load Miller into the wagon, he looked at me. He didn't look angry. He looked resigned. "You know, Jack," he called out, his voice raspy. "You were right about the eyes. Kincaid had dead eyes. But you should look in the mirror sometime." I turned away. I didn't want to think about that. I just wanted a hot coffee and a long sleep. But I knew sleep wouldn't come easy. It never does when you realize how fragile the truth really is. The sun didn't rise the next morning so much as the darkness just slowly turned into a bruised, dirty gray. I sat in the captain's office, nursing a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. The station was chaotic. Internal affairs swarming like ants on a dropped candy bar, reporters shouting questions from the front steps, and the phone ringing off the hook. But inside the office, it was quiet. Miller and O'Hagan turned on each other before the ink was dry on their booking sheets. That's the thing about corruption. It's a partnership based on profit, not loyalty. Once the profit is gone and the jail cell door slams shut, every man is for himself. O'Hagan spilled everything to cut a deal. He admitted to snapping Vance's neck. He admitted to the canvas sack. He admitted that Miller had orchestrated the whole thing, the blackmail, the murder, and the suicide of Thomas Kincaid. Miller took the fall hard. He stopped talking, stopped eating. He just stared at the wall of his cell, probably replaying the moment he decided to cross the line, wondering if it was worth it. It never is. But the law dealing with the criminals is the easy part. The hard part is what happens to the people left in the wreckage. I went to see Sylvia Moore 2 days later. She was packing her things in that small, cluttered apartment. The porcelain dolls were wrapped in newspaper, their painted eyes hidden away. She looked older. The youth had been drained out of her, replaced by a jittery, brittle exhaustion. "I'm going back to Ohio," she told me, taping up a box. She didn't look at me. "My sister lives there. It's quiet." "That sounds like a good idea," I said. I stood in the doorway, feeling like an intruder. She stopped and looked at her hands. "I killed him, didn't I?" "No," I said firmly. "Miller and O'Hagan killed him. They killed Vance, and they killed Kincaid." But I pointed the finger. She whispered, her voice cracking. I stood behind that glass and I said, "That's him." If I hadn't done that, if I hadn't been so sure, if you hadn't done that, they would have found another way, I told her. It was a lie, mostly. A kindness. The truth was, her identification gave them the perfect cover. It allowed them to close the case and murder a patsy without anyone asking questions. Her fear had been their weapon. She looked up at me then, and I saw the haunted look that I knew would never fully leave her. But I saw him, Jack. Even now, knowing what I know, if I close my eyes, I still see Kincaid's face in that alley. I see the scar. I see the twitch. My mind won't let it go. "The mind protects itself, Sylvia," I said. "It fills in the blanks. You were terrified. You saw the monster you knew, instead of the monster you didn't." I drove her to the train station. We stood on the platform in the mist, the steam from the engine curling around our legs. She hugged me, a quick, desperate embrace, and then she was gone. I watched the train disappear into the fog, carrying a woman who would spend the rest of her life doubting her own eyes. I didn't go back to the station. I drove to the Potter's Field on the edge of the city. That's where they buried Thomas Kincaid. There was no headstone, just a numbered marker in the wet grass. Kincaid was no saint. He was a thief, a stalker, a man who preyed on women's fears. But he didn't kill Arthur Vance. He died because he was convenient. He died because he had a scar and a bad reputation, and that was enough to doom him. I stood there for a long time, the rain soaking through my coat. I thought about the nature of evidence. We rely on eyewitnesses. We trust people to tell us what they saw. But what if seeing isn't believing? What if seeing is just projecting? Sylvia's memory was perfect, detailed, and completely false. She remembered every pore on a face that wasn't there. It made me wonder how many other people were sitting in prison because a witness knew what they saw. The department tried to give me a commendation, a medal for rooting out corruption. I turned it down. You don't take a medal for cleaning up your own mess. Miller was my partner for 3 years. I sat in a car with him, drank coffee with him, trusted him with my life. And I never saw the mask he was wearing either. I retired 6 months later. The job had changed for me. Every time a witness sat across from my desk and said, "I'll never forget his face," I felt a cold chill. I'd look at them and wonder, are you remembering the truth? Or are you just painting a picture over the darkness? I still walk by the Starlight Lounge sometimes. It's gone now, replaced by a laundromat with flickering fluorescent lights. The alley is still there, though. I walked down it last week. I stood where Vance died. I looked up at the window where the reflection had been. It's just a dirty alley. Bricks, trash, puddles. But it's the place where I learned that the scariest thing in the world isn't a man with a gun, or even a corrupt cop. The scariest thing is the human mind, because it can convince you of anything. It can make you see a scar on a masked man. It can make you trust a partner who is planning to kill you. It can rewrite reality until it fits the story you need to believe. I often think about what Miller said to me before they took him away. Look in the mirror. I do, every morning. I look at my own eyes, my own scars, and I ask myself, what am I not seeing? What am I inventing to make sense of the world? This case didn't have a happy ending. The innocent died, the guilty destroyed each other, and the survivor was left with a broken mind. But it's the case that stays with me. It's the one that wakes me up at 3 a.m., listening to the rain against the window, wondering if the things I remember are real or just ghosts I've dressed up in familiar clothes. Memory is a canvas sack, folks. You never really know what's inside until you cut it open, and by then it's usually too late. Thank you for listening to this case file. It's been a heavy one, I know. But these are the stories that need to be told, the ones that remind us to look a little closer, to question a little deeper. And what's the strangest case you ever heard of? I'd like to read your stories in the comments.